If you've stuck around since the beginning of this series, and you're exhausted from all the math thunder, I've got good news for you. This video is finally where we get to apply everything we've learned from EN diagrams, and actually compare some in-game aircraft performance. Before we get into the weeds of things though, here are a few additional things that I should explain about these new sets of graphs. First of all, I added a dot here at the bottom to show the maximum specific excess power this aircraft can achieve. This is also the point max climb rate is achieved for this aircraft at this altitude, so it is worth keeping track of. Now to compare two different graphs, we can overlay their outlines like this and see their energy maneuverability profiles. Here I'm comparing the P51D5 to the XP50. And as you can see just from the outlines, the XP50 is able to achieve a higher turn rate below 450 kph, but begins to compress after that. Because the P51D cannot turn as hard and so cannot have a state in this area, this zone is exclusive to the XP50. While because the XP50 cannot go as fast as the P51D, this zone is exclusive to the P51. Now, if we plot the specific excess power contours, things start to look pretty messy to the point where this graph isn't really readable. To fix this, we can remove most of the specific excess contours and just leave the zero excess power contours. It would, however, be nice to have this information conveyed by the other contours, just in an easier to read format. Well, when we're comparing aircraft performance, what we're mainly interested in is the difference in a specific excess power between the two aircraft at a certain point. Most importantly, aircraft with a higher specific excess power will lose less speed, and so will have the energy advantage in that situation. For instance, at this point you can see that the XP50 has an excess power of -50, while the P51 has an excess power of -40. This would mean that if both were performing this exact turn at 600 kph at 20 degrees per second, the XP50 would be losing more energy, and so the P51 would have the advantage. This difference is pretty easy to see in a 3D plot, but how do we show this in our 2D plot? Well, what we can do instead of plotting the contours individually is that we can plot the difference between the specific energy contours using a gradient fill. So this is what it looks like. Here you can see that the areas shaded in red are the areas where the P51 has a higher specific excess power, and here are the areas shaded in blue where the XP50 would have a higher specific excess power and so would have an energy advantage. In the middle here, where the color is paler, the difference is relatively minimal, and the darker the color, the bigger the difference in excess power. For this comparison, we can see that the XP50's sustained turn rate is tighter and also at the same speed, meaning that the XP50 would win in a horizontal rate fight. It would also win in a vertical climbing fight because this edge over here is blue, meaning that in low speed turns, the XP50 turns both tighter and also keeps more energy in those turns. The XP50 has a lower corner speed and a slightly lower max instantaneous turn rate. Meanwhile, the P51D5 has a faster max straight line speed and is also able to turn much better at higher speeds. Based on this information, the XP50 would win pretty easily in a turn fight below 450 kph, while the P51 would prefer to keep the fight above 500 kph. To achieve that kind of high-speed fight, the P51D would have to work pretty hard, and would have to either start at an altitude advantage and dive and hope that the XP50 follows, but if they aren't able to kill the XP50 before they run out of altitude and speed, they can try to run away from the XP50 using their higher straight line speed. This does only reset the situation, but it does let you go in for another attempt. Now some disclaimers. While I'm pretty confident with the outline shapes for these contours, the specific excess power lines and the gradients are pretty prone to errors. I explained my process in the previous video, and if you've watched that, you'll know that the data isn't very clean and the curve fit isn't perfect either. The intersection points for the contours along the edges of the graph are pretty solid for these purposes, and for ARB it's pretty good, but the middle area and the left and right edges are kind of sketchy. Also, these graphs were generated by testing in ARB, meaning that the true lift limit and structural limits are actually higher above this profile. Because I haven't tested for anything outside of ARB, anything beyond the outlines that I've shown here probably isn't 100% accurate. Basically, the stuff along the top edges and bottom edges are high confidence, but stuff along the left and right, as well as the middle, are more prone to errors. So, first off, let's take a look at how different flap settings affect the EM diagram. Here's the graph for the P51D5 comparing retracted and combat flaps, and you can see that the flaps let the plane turn tighter, but reduce its specific excess power, meaning that the plane will bleed more speed. Using landing flaps increases the turn more, but causes even more speed bleed. Ripping the flaps off causes the plane to fly basically the same as with the flaps retracted, because of the way that Gaijin models flaps to not have any surface area themselves. You can see that there are discrepancies between the two graphs, but these are due to the sort of messiness of the data and fitting. The main points of interest like climb, turn rate, max speed, and everything else are roughly in the same spots. The coloration of this gradient make it look like there is a difference in specific excess power here because it's pretty dark, but this is because the color saturation is actually scaled to the maximum difference for this specific graph. So the difference is actually pretty small, it's just dark because the whole graph's overall difference is also pretty small. Now let's compare some aircraft. I've basically tested every 4.0 and 4.3 plane that I consider to be somewhat of a competitive air-to-air plane. I skipped a few planes that have similar flight models to each other that I didn't think were worth testing too much, so in total I have EM diagrams for 30 planes. These planes were tested at 300 meters altitude using the highest throttle setting, either WEP or 100%, with no flaps. I would test at different altitudes and different throttle settings and different flaps for each plane if I had infinite time and patience, but this alone took me 2 days of just staring at test flights and checking results and hoping my computer doesn't die. So unless there's something very specific that I'm interested in comparing, I won't be doing any more tests in the immediate future. Each of the EM diagrams for individual specific planes are in the shared Google Drive folder in the description, so you can take a look at them on your own, but for this video I'll actually be comparing every airframe against the BF109 F4, a plane I chose as a benchmark because it's relatively okay at most things. It doesn't really excel in anything particular other than low-speed energy fights. So let's get started. Here's the graph for the D5 versus the 109, and against the D5, the 109 turns just a bit better, but also has a higher climb and sustained turn rate, so would prefer a horizontal or climbing turn fight, while the D5 would prefer fights at higher speeds like a diving spiral, so that it can use its top speed and disengage if necessary. Against an XP50, the 109 does compress less than the XP50, but has a lower top speed and a lower turn rate, meaning that its best shot is to try and go for the vertical stall fight. Depending on whether the XP50 uses flaps though, this is going to be very tough to win, and in most cases you'll probably just lose. The F4U4 is very fast, but turns pretty poorly, so that 109 can pretty comfortably turn fight and rate fight it at most speeds. The F4U4 does still have pretty good flaps at low speeds though, so be careful about that. The F6F5N turns surprisingly tighter than the 109, but as you can see from the red along this edge, the 109 has a higher specific excess power during this turn, meaning that the 109 has a better maneuvering energy retention. This means that the F6F would want to bring the fight into some kind of a diving spiral to maintain its higher turn without losing too much speed. If on the deck though, the F6F would need to win quickly while it has the speed, since its sustained turn rate is lower than the 109, so once it's performed about a 180 degree turn, it's probably bled all of its speed and will perform worse. The F6F also has a better linear energy retention and a higher top speed, so it could attempt to run and reset. The P38J has a worse turn than the 109, but also has really good flaps, so with some proper flap usage, the fight would probably be pretty even. Without flaps though, the P38J can still outrun the 109. The P47 also has pretty good flaps, but also a much worse energy retention, so like most US fighters, it relies on speed and altitude to force high-speed fights where they can try and either force an overshoot or run away. The P51D10 has the same outline as the D5, but also has a much better engine, so the playstyle is pretty similar, but with a much higher top speed and energy retention, the D10 will have a much easier time winning against the 109. It still has a slightly worse turn rate, but it can use its flaps to a lot more efficacy thanks to the extra thrust. The 109 would prefer to keep this fight in the low-speed vertical where it still has the advantage, but you'll have to worry a lot more about the D10 going for stall shots with the flaps. The P61C has its entire flight envelope inside the 109s, and also has a much worse maneuvering energy retention, so can really only push head-ons, run, use an altitude advantage, or try and use the gunner to win in a 1v1. Otherwise, it's kind of dead. The P63 is surprisingly good at low altitudes, being very similar to the 109 but with a higher top speed. It also has much better energy retention, so it would be very dangerous to try and engage at low altitudes. So it would be probably better to fight them at higher altitudes where its engine performance starts to decay. At low altitude, you still have a slight advantage at very low speeds, but I wouldn't put too much faith in this small difference. Now on to the German planes. If you didn't know, the 109 G2 is straight up worse than the F4 at most altitudes. So unless you really want the 20mm gun pods to tank your performance even more, I wouldn't recommend taking the G2, just fly the F4. The Do 335A1 has very good linear energy retention and a very high max airframe speed, but its max straight line speed is surprisingly mediocre. It will still outrun a 109, but unless you started with a dive, a lot of Americans can still catch you in a straight line. Very much an early game plane that relies on altitude advantage and head-ons to win. The Focke-Wulf 190 is surprisingly similar to the Do 335 in characteristics, just less extreme. Poor turn, good energy retention. This plane would be strictly limited to high-speed diving attacks if it weren't for its excellent roll and very good low-speed flaps, which aren't shown on this graph. So in those situations, it can try and pull off interesting reversals, but otherwise it's a very sad plane. The I-185 is very similar to the 190, but has a higher top speed and a lower airframe speed limit. Generally, I'm not a fan of these planes in air RB, but they can be pretty fun to use in ground RB since you can use your roll and energy retention to perform overshoot fights without worrying too much about getting third-partied. The ITP is kind of just the 109 but worse. Worse turn, worse MER. Very few things it can do better, but at least it has good guns. The Yak-3 is a very evil plane to fight in the 109. It turns better and holds its energy better. It has better low and high speed performance, it has a higher top speed, and a better climb rate. If you're stuck in a dogfight against the Yak-3 at low altitude, you better pray that they suck because there is basically nothing you can do. The only real solution in a 1v1 is to fight at altitude where the Yak-3 loses more engine power, or bring the fight into a dive and hope the Yak-3 rips their wings before you do. The Yak-9K and the Yak-9T have the same airframe as the Yak-3, but also have a worse engine, meaning that while the outline is the same, the fight is a lot fairer. The 109 has a better linear and maneuvering energy retention below 450 kph, so while the Yak does turn better, you have a bit more options, like running or climbing away using flaps in turn fights, etc. The Spitfire F Mark 9 is another one of those evil planes to fight. And at low altitude, there's not much a 109 can do other than run away since the Spitfire turns so much better than it. The Spit does have pretty poor energy retention, so diving to run away is pretty viable, but to kill the Spitfire, you're going to want to either engage with an altitude advantage or with a teammate. You could try to do a vertical fight, but that would be incredibly risky and you'll be trying to force an advantage where the difference is basically non-existent. The Spitfire Mark 5B is actually better than the F Mark 9 while being at a lower BR. It turns better and tighter, climbs better, holds its speed better. The F Mark 9 has a supercharger that makes it heavier, so its performance evens out around 5 kilometers in altitude, but the Mark 5B is straight up better in most situations. The Typhoon Mark 1BL is another plane that on paper looks like the 109 but just better. Better energy retention, better turn, better top speed, better guns. While those are true, it does have a poor roll, so in any flat scissors dogfight, the Typhoon will struggle quite a bit. It also climbs pretty poorly, so use that to your advantage. The Wyvern strengths are pretty obvious in that it has an insanely high max straight line speed of 650 kph. Only a few American planes can even attempt to keep up with its dust. It also climbs pretty well at low altitude, but it has a low turn rate and maneuvering energy retention, so the only real way of dealing with them is to catch them while they're slow, or you can try and flip the weighted coin and take the head-on. The Zero turns comically hard with the insane instantaneous and sustained turn rate, but obviously has a poor energy retention and max speed. You can only really boom and zoom this kind of a plane. The Ki 43 is very similar, but has a bit of a better energy retention and climb, so be careful just as much when fighting them. The Ki 100 and other Ki 61s are much better rounded, still turning quite well, but with a higher straight line speed, and better energy retention. It has a mediocre climb and poor roll though, so try and fight it with an energy advantage. The G55 turns tighter than the 109, but overall has a worse climb and energy retention, and its sustained turn rate is not that much better than the 109. The 109 could probably disengage and outclimb the G55 if the situation looks bad. The C202 turns very similarly to the 109, but has a very bad linear energy retention and a very bad climb. It does have better maneuvering energy retention, but once the speed while turning is gone, the C202 is put in a much worse position than the 109, so not much that the 202 can win in any kind of situation. SM92 is similar to the C202 but less extreme. While it doesn't climb or run that well, it has a good maneuvering energy retention, so it can use that in tandem with its flaps to turn it pretty well. It still relies on its air spawn and guns to win a lot of dogfights though. The VB10C is like the Do 335 if it turned a bit better. Not the craziest max straight line speed, but still a very good linear energy retention, meaning it keeps its speed after its dive pretty well. Optimized for high speeds while being pretty subpar at anything else. Its flaps are still pretty good though. The A21 is kind of depressing. It has a similar turn profile to the 109, but with a much worse energy retention, turn rate, max speed, basically much worse everything. Its main selling point, of course, is its guns, but overall still a very underwhelming package. You really have to rely on head-ons and killing people that aren't aware of you. The pure Mirsky is basically the 109 if it climbed much better, turned better, and compressed a little bit earlier. Very worth the trade-off. It also has very good flaps, so if the 109 was good in the vertical, the pure Mirsky is basically an uncontestable monster. And that's all the planes I compared. Let me know if there's a set of two planes here that I've shown that you'd like me to compare with the red-blue gradient plot, and I can make it and add it to the drive really quickly. If you want to see EM diagrams of a plane I haven't tested, or planes with different flap settings or at different altitudes, then I'm sorry, but I think I'll vomit if I look at another test flight screen. I'm basically done using test flight for the rest of the week. I'll still be making videos on other topics, so keep an eye out for those, but this is all I got for now. I'll see you guys later.